Well, good afternoon, folks, and thanks for coming to another one of our TESS seminars. TESS, of course, is our Center for Tropical Environmental and Sustainability Science, and it's our main terrestrial forum here on the JCU, here in the JCU campus generally. We're really pleased today to have Dr. Noel Preece talking to us. Noel is a veteran of the field of what might be called carbon farming, which is, you probably know, there's a lot of different landowners and other entities these days that are trying to capture carbon in various kinds of plantings and other kinds of schemes. And Noel and his wife, Penny Van Oosterzee, for the past 20 years or so, have been running a major project over an area of almost 200 hectares up on the Atherton tableland and doing various kinds of plantation experiments. And they're also been very tied into the policy arena around this space. So they've been very, very locked into that. So very good people to hear from on this issue. Noel got his PhD from Charles Darwin University. He worked for a while as a consultant. He also worked for the Conservation Commission of the Northern Territory and also as a park researchers in New South Wales. I think that's about 80% correct, I think, which is good enough for the current purpose. Anyway, folks, thanks very much for attending, and please join me in welcoming Noel. Thank you.
Picking up is the important thing. It is picking up, okay. Well, thank you for coming to this talk. It was suggested actually by Annabelle because she's had a few inquiries about carbon farming and whether it was even an option. So what I wanted to do today was to talk about some of our experience and the work we've done over the last few years. First, I'd like to acknowledge Penny Van Oosterzee, who's my wife and co-conspirator in this research we've been doing. We set up this experiment in 2010 and they got an ARC grant and so on to establish it, and we contributed some money as well. And many others, Lucas, Bill's been involved, Susan Lawrence, Anna Palmer. There's a whole range of people who have actually been working on our place. We've had a number of students go through who have done some astonishing work to build on start some of the projects, and then some have built on those projects over the last few years. I'd like to also acknowledge country, traditional owners, First Nations peoples from this part of the world. I live on and work on Nadjon country, but there are many other nations that are involved in the wet tropics. There's at least 20 different nations, and I've worked across the northern savanna regions and the deserts for the last 40 or so years, and I've worked in hundreds of different First Nations countries, and I acknowledge them for their contributions to looking after country. This talk is really about carbon plantings and whether they can actually contribute to what we need to do about the future of the landscape, and focusing on the wet tropics because that's where we work. Most of our work is actually related to the wet tropics, but it does have broader context as well. And I'm going to go through some of the problems we face, and then through some of the evidence we've got about how we can resolve some of those problems. And then I'll work on how we can, I'll give an example of how restoration can work at scale. And then I'll show you some evidence from some of the work that we and others have done, both on our place and other places in the wet tropics, that contribute to both carbon and biodiversity. So it's not one or the other. It's just, trees do have some biodiversity benefit, and I'll explain that a bit as I go through. Also, I want to address some of the roadblocks to implementing practices that could do better for us, for the landscape, and for the species we are caretakers of, and come up with some of the solutions or suggestions for solutions. Okay, first thing is context. In the last 30 or so years, 30 plus years, there's been 33,000 hectares cleared, and that's out of a total of wet tropics. It's been cleared of 460,000 hectares, which is quite disturbing, but it hasn't stopped. In the last 4 years, in the last period of the statewide land and tree assessment done by the Queensland government, there's been another 4,000 plus hectares cleared. And that's not just in the wet tropics, but in Cape York, it's worse. There's about 9,000 cleared, almost 10,000 cleared in the last 4 years, which is surprisingly disturbing. And when I look at those figures, I'm always disturbed. It just shocks me every time I see them. In the wet tropics, there was about 1,400 cleared, some of it partial, most of it major, some of it minor, but it's not compensated for by regrowth. There's about 1,000 hectares regrown in the wet tropics in the last period, 21-22. But that's regrowth. That's like they're little trees, and the regrowth is monitored from the time you can actually see them from satellite imagery. So it's not serious recovery. So the context in the wet tropics, I'm just giving you an example here because I've got all the layers, but you can't display them all. But this is just one really good example of the last period. This is clearing in a number of time blocks going back to 1988. And then the first period, there was that much cleared. The next period, there was a bit more cleared. As you can see, it's increasing all the time. The next period, about 5 or 6 years, it's increased again. And then in the last period, about 5 or 6 years, it's increased once again. And guess how much has been replanted? This is the total of the CRRP, the Community Rainforest Reforestation Program that was run in 93 to about 2000, but it stopped about 97. That's the largest revegetation exercise that's been done in the tropics, wet tropics, since that period of clearing. So that was 1,700 hectares, and it doesn't even come close to restoring the loss that we've faced in that period. And this clearing has real impacts on biodiversity. That's just a map of one of the roosts, the red line around purple. Oh, it's not showing at all. Yeah, you can see the purple line around there. That's one roost of spectacled flying foxes, and the orange and yellow patches on that are recent clearing of that roost. That I mapped that roost before some of that clearing happened, so it's happening as we speak, virtually, and a lot of it's protected under the Vegetation Management Act, but not very well, obviously. So there's a real problem with this ongoing clearing. There's a simple solution, of course, to this ongoing clearing: just stop it. So that's the end of my talk. Recovery, reforestation. One would think that there's a lot of talk about reforestation in the region, but it's pretty poor. It's really hard to find documentation, and I'm on the Restoration Alliance steering group, and we don't have an inventory of what's been replanted. I've got some ideas and I've got some of it mapped, but it's not complete. I talked to C4, the Cassowary Coast Community Reforestation Program. They think they've probably got 8 or 9 hectares in the last decade or so, maybe 30 hectares with other projects going in the region, but that's sort of like total of 30 hectares in the coastal region, maybe. In the tablelands, which is predominantly operated by TREAT, the Trees for the Revegetation of Evelyn and Atherton tablelands, they produce about 30,000 trees a year, but they plant in densities of about 3,000 hectares, 3,000 trees per hectare. So there's about maybe 10 hectares a year. There's a single big project by South Endeavour up on the tablelands, which is proposing to do about 60 hectares over the next 3 or 4 years, 22 to 24. That's 60 hectares of the land that's been lost. QPWS, in a recent newsletter from TREAT, they reported 20 hectares recovered around one of their parks over the last 28 years. most of the other regions, it's really hard to find what's been done, so it's not mapped. So I'm guessing at maybe 10% replacement, but I suspect it's way, way below that. It's just not happening. So what can be done about it? I've got an example that has been dismissed on a number of occasions as being, oh, it's just a forestry planting, but it's called the CRRP, or Community Rainforest Reforestation Program, which was established sort of around the time of the World Heritage listings, because foresters were up in arms about loss of the timber available for the mills, you know, especially cabinet timbers and structural timbers and so on. And so there was a amount of money put in, about $10 million put in by the Commonwealth Government to basically compensate farmers and foresters for the loss of that potential forest resource. It ran from about 93 to about 2000, covered about 1,780 odd hectares, and they planted in classic forestry sort of planting densities and mixes, about 1,000 trees, 1,100 trees per hectare. Some of them were in 400 trees per hectare. It's not clear what they were. I've got the records, but they don't actually document that. And in the 2000 year 2000 figures, it would have cost around 5,600 per hectare. And it's important to remember that, because we're talking later about the actual costs of revegetation. But it's been dismissed as being not of any biodiversity value. And that's part of what I think is the problem. That's the largest reforestation program that's been done in the last 30 years at least. But, and this is the problem, it's been labelled as farm forestry, as if it didn't have much relevance to what, you know, some in the audience might be concerned about, the biodiversity values. And it was said in one of the papers that there were a few species planted, includes eucalypts and non-local species. But in fact, most of the species were local, most of the species were rainforest, and there were eucalypts in there as well. But there was 170 different rainforest species. And despite it being dismissed, it's actually survived. And I'm currently in the process of remapping those plots to find out what still exists and what condition they're in, what structure they're in. And more than half of them are actually still in good condition, still survive. Some have been bulldozed. I'm not sure that any have been logged, because there's no mill suitable for things like Queensland maple in the region, so they're rarely logged. But most of them survive, and many of them actually provide really good habitat. And they've got closed canopies, they've got species in there that are wet tropic endemic species of plants and animals. And so we've got evidence to show that, such as research that was done at Donahue's corridor between Lakesbury and Eacham. Not quite the same planting, but it's clear that when you've got a rainforest canopy or closed canopy, you're going to have species in that closed canopy forest that are of value. They're actually occupying and using, and they're bringing seeds in and that sort of thing. I will get back to the Donahue's corridor example, but first there are a couple of persistent myths. One is that a biodiversity planting is what we do. It's been said to us just recently that we only do biodiversity plantings. Well, I'm not sure what a biodiversity planting is. If it's to mean close spacing, high density plantings, it probably has biodiversity value. But it doesn't necessarily mean that is the only way of doing it, because a lot of these plantings that I was talking about with the CRRP actually have biodiversity value. So it's not one or the other. It's not a cut-off point. It's also said that you need high density plantings to get a good growth. That's not necessarily the case. That cheap equals nasty, like by the opposite, premium product only comes at a premium cost. I don't agree with that, because I think it's a myth, and we've got demonstrated evidence, we've got evidence to show that. The second myth is that you can only get a closed canopy by close plantings. Well, that's clearly not the case. We've been able to demonstrate that with our research and other research. So you can have wider spacings, even at what are called forestry spacings, and get a closed canopy. And the third myth is that forestry methods don't have biodiversity value. Now, correcting these myths, I would have thought that evidence would carry the day, but it doesn't always. Over the last 12 years, we've done the experiment on our property. It's a large-scale experiment, one of the few in the world that has been done for reforestation in tropical regions. It's one of the larger ones, and we've got it registered with TreativeNet and Restore, and there are very few like this anywhere in the world. We used tried and tested forestry methods to plant, because the alternative was to use augers and rip with bulldozers on slopes that are 30 to 40 degrees. And the driver said to me, I said, can you rip that? And he said, yeah, I can rip it straight down if you want, which sort of defeats the purpose, because the soil would all be at the bottom of the hill. So our slopes were way too steep for that. So we used forestry methods, basically a planter spade with tube stock small trees. And the project was for carbon and biodiversity, and we've been able to demonstrate that. And it was done cost effectively. And the part of the research was to work out how we could do this sort of work cost effectively. The project has been running since 2010. We've got over 30 scientific papers and conference presentations and so on from this work, which is a reasonably impressive project for a single site. We've investigated small mammals, dung beetles, ants, flies, bees, and a number of others. And we've done modelling of the cost effectiveness of restoration. And it's backed up with modelling by economists. That's not an ecologist trying to do financial modelling. We've actually done it in a proper way. And we've found that you can actually, if you plant it at reasonable densities at lowish costs, you can actually make some money from carbon plantings within a few years. It depends on how many you plant and what density it is and what price the carbon is. The days when we first sold some of these carbon credits, they were restricted to around $14 a tonne. They're now at about $34 a tonne. And on the open market for biodiversity or co-benefit carbon credits, we can get $80 to $100 a tonne. So it's become very, very cost effective, and you break even. And break even means it's covering opportunity costs. And opportunity costs being the loss of your income from taking cattle or whatever else you're growing there, taking that off until the trees produce the carbon benefits and you can start getting carbon credits. So that takes into account that. So it is cost effective. The results of our research, well, the coverage of the research went from bees and flies, mammals, to allometrics, like the measurement of trees and growth models and function, the function of the forests, the cost, crown cover, survival rates and survival factors and so on. Some of it has been used to inform the national carbon accounting model, which is used by the Commonwealth, which is how we get the carbon credits. Because prior to our research and some work that was done by Syra up in the tablelands, the modelling was based on southern eucalypt and pine plantations of all things, which and recalibrated to take into account wet tropics, humid environments, warmer environments. So that has actually contributed through the work of Karen Paul and others. And we've been able to compare that with some of the remnant forests, again, on our place and on other properties as well. I'm just going to give you one example of some of the research, just talking about how our plantings have actually responded. They've already, the rainforest species have already been coming in very early in the days, but I wanted to focus for a moment on dung beetles, which is a really useful functional group because they're syntoptic. They actually have a narrow range of preferences, not only for habitat, but also the species of dung they eat and roll away. So some are specific to paddymellons or wallabies, some are specific to possums or a group of possums, and that sort of thing. So they can be really good indicators of how the forest is functioning. And so we've done quite a bit of work on that and produced some results. And they're a great animal to deal with because you can get lots of numbers, and therefore you can get nice graphs that produce nice images for scientists who are interested in getting coefficient of variation and so on into their pictures. And what we've found is that the the plantings respond fairly quickly and start to provide ecosystem function fairly early on in the piece. And this is not a time series in this image, but it shows that dung beetles have responded quite quickly to the plantings, depending to some degree on the number of species. In other words, the monoculture is less productive than the mixed species plantings, and the richest mixes of plantings produce a better habitat, which you might expect. So it's a reasonable assumption. Dung beetles are really important for dung removal, of course, but they've got to have the dung to roll or bury. And they're also extremely important for seed dispersal. And we've got a lot of natural recruits. We've done studies of natural recruits as well. And the dung beetles actually produce good dispersal of seeds. So we've found some really positive results through using an indicator species, if you like. And it sort of corroborates with other work we've done on mammals and starting to do some work on birds. Birds are a bit more difficult because they're not faithful to a particular type of planting. They move too quickly. Mammals, we had a student here, Tegan Whitehead, who did her honours on our property and some other properties in the tablelands, and found that the age of the planting was very important, and that mammals responded over time to the age of the planting, and over time started to accommodate more rainforest specialists. In other words, it took them a while to come in, but they actually came in. They produced some interesting stuff. Now, I'm not going into the detail of that, of course, because that's not the main focus of the meeting. I go back to Donaghy's corridor. That's a site that was planted about 3,000 trees per hectare over a period of time, over a period of about 10 or 15 years, it goes back 30 years. And there's been some recent work done by, the Donaghy's corridors, that patch just there. These are CRRP plantings, mapped, some of them on the tablelands that are still existing. So they're not far away from those plantings, and they've got similar characteristics. But what they found is similar to what we found on our place, where over time, the species of fauna actually start to mimic what's found in the remnant rainforest. So they're actually providing a biodiversity function and service. So I come back to the evidence that these wider spacings do and can provide biodiversity and carbon benefits. We planted in such a way that we were trying to keep our costs low, about 2.5 to 3 metres apart, sometimes a bit closer, but 1,600 to 1,000 trees per hectare. 1,000 trees per hectare, if we had good survival, we were getting closed canopy within a couple of years. And some recent work that's been done with Carly Middleby and Lucas and Alex is showing that the canopies are actually touching within a year and a half. So they're actually starting to close over within a year and a half, and the Rainforest Rescue's been involved in that as well. So it does show that these canopies can close pretty quickly if you've got good survival, because the trees are actually, they've got big, wide canopies. So you don't need to have them so close that, a metre apart or 2 metres apart. You can have them a bit wider and still get the same sorts of benefits over time. It's important, however, and we wrote a paper on this, about survival. If you can increase your survival, then you're going to be on a winner. And it's hard to get a sense of how many trees in a plantation survive, because most of the planters don't record death rates. They don't record what dies, but they do replace the trees. So it might look like a really successful planting, but it's because they've been replaced, but not recorded that it's been replaced. So you get these plantings that look really fantastic, but the trees have been replaced. And I've had reports from people saying that they've got, they're 30 or 40% survival. They're pretty happy with that. I wouldn't be happy with 30 or 40% survival. I was not happy with 60% survival in one of our experiments. So we've been aiming for 80, 90% survival, and we've been able to demonstrate that you can actually do that by doing some more research on how you can improve your planting methods to make that survival increase, and you can get 80, 90% survival just by modifying your practices enough so that these trees are going to survive in a much greater proportion. And by doing all these things, you can keep your costs low, because if you have to replant trees that die, you're going to have to go back in. You've got more plants to buy. You've got to take them in. You've got to dig holes. You've got to put them in the ground, and you may have to water them in some situations. So you need to increase your survival so that you can keep costs low. Every aspect of this costs. And the reason I'm talking about 1,000 trees compared to, say, 3,000 trees is that every tree costs $2 to $3 or $4, depending on where you buy it, what plant you're getting. So every time you increase it by 1,000 per hectare, you've got another $3,000 per hectare to factor in. And it doesn't really change your management's situation. It's more to do with the upfront costs. And it's very clear from our work that the plantings using forestry methods can have, and do have in our situation, high biodiversity value. This is an example from just 5 plots on our place. In the top, I'll just turn my back to you again. Top right there, it's a 3 metre wide monoculture. The top half didn't survive well because the plants were left out overnight and weren't planted until midday the next day. And we were told this after they were planted by the planters. Oh, yeah, we forgot to tell you that, but that's probably why they died. We had a few cases like that, and it was one of the reasons we were able to investigate and understand why these plants die. One next to it is a 1.75 metre spacing. It was a monoculture, just a single species of plant. It's the Queensland maple, Flendersia browniana, which was planted at 1.7 metres, which is about 3,500 trees per hectare. Most of the trees in that plot are native recruits. They've come in, they've dominated, they've actually taken over. The Flendersias are still coming up through it, but you've got a whole range of things, from Policius to the sarsaparilla and so on. So and bleeding heart, of course, that comes in. So that's done really well. But the next one down on the right hand side there, this one here, 1.75, 3,260 trees per hectare, same sort of density of canopy. But then we come down to the bottom one here, that's 3 metres spacing, 1,100 trees, same density of crown as this plot here, which is almost half the space and almost three times the number of trees per hectare. And then we've got a sprayed control over here, which is 3 metres sprayed. And what I mean is the controls were sprayed, some of the controls were sprayed at 3 metres spacing. So they spray a strip, leave a strip of grass, which is the way we did the plantings, and then a strip of sprayed grass, and that allowed trees to actually come up within the control plot. Without that, the trees are just not coming up. And Susan and some others have got some work going on our place looking at why these controls are not responding to release from grazing and so on. So there's good evidence now that these plantings actually have biodiversity value. Bill was pleased I wasn't talking about spectacled flying foxes today, but I will mention them in one point because there's a planting at Shannonvale Winery, if you know, down that part of the country up around towards Port Douglas, down from Gigan, not Gigan, yeah, anyway, which was planted about 1990, just in by the farmer, fairly widely spaced trees. That's providing a really, really valuable resource. About 5,000 animals are often found there, and that's out of a population of, we think, about 75,000. So it's a significant population of spectacled flying foxes, and they're endangered species. And on our place, we've got a whole host of animals already in the plantings. Every time we go out for a walk, often with the dogs, we find a lot of these species within the planted plots, even now. You know, we've been seeing them for years, but they're just increasing in numbers. Now, going back to the beginning of the talk about carbon farming potential and is it going to provide a benefit over time to biodiversity and the wet tropics restoration. Well, the carbon farming requirements under the method we're using requires 20% ground cover, a potential for, there's no target for that over time. It's just got to have the potential for having a 20% crown cover. They must be able to reach 2 metres tall, which is a bit above my head. That's sort of height. And your minimum area is 0.2 hectares. And it's supposed to be a mixed species. It's not supposed to be a monoculture, except where a monoculture is native. At a spacing of about 4 to 5 metres, and a canopy expected of a radius of 2.5 metres or a diameter of 5 metres, that only takes 500 trees per hectare. So that's enough to meet the carbon requirements and start to get carbon benefits from the carbon credits you sell. And we've been able to do some costing, we've got some recent costs from some local suppliers, and at various spacings of 3 by 3 metres, which is 1,100 trees per hectare, under $9,000 per hectare. If you want to increase your density and maybe 2,000 trees per hectare, it might go up to around 13,000. So your break even will be somewhere in the range of 5 to 7 years, depending very much on the carbon price. But you will see a return, and that's really important, as I get into shortly. Now, I've been puzzling since we started this project why carbon farming has not been taken up. There are 9 projects registered with the regulator in Canberra in the wet tropics. That's the total. The only ones that have claimed any credits are us. We've got 26,000 credits out of the 27,000 that have been issued for the whole of the wet tropics. And to us, that's been quite valuable. It's over 300,000. That's, I was saying that the original price was about $14. It's gone up to 34 at the moment on the open market. So we could make a lot more money when we sell the next lot. So it's been valuable to us. And I'll tell you what, it's a far, far more valuable thing to us because of our steep country than cattle. We would not have made anywhere near that for cattle. We'd be lucky to make 20,000 every couple of years out of cattle. So 300,000 plus has been really rewarding to us. So why haven't these things been taken up? The most recent reasonable amount of money that's been available from the government has been the Land Restoration Fund. It's got certain prescriptions to it, but the costs for just a few hectares, about 170 hectares have been proposed, have been inordinately high in our regard, from 34,000 per hectare up to over 100,000 per hectare, according to the funding and the area that's covered. It's really just 3 projects, and it's a total of about 170 hectares. If we'd kept the costs down to around 8,000, say, and you can play with figures, that's fine, you can play with figures, but if it was 8,000 per hectare and you could do that at scale, we could have planted 1,375 hectares instead of the 170 that's proposed. So we've got less than 12% of the potential reforestation. Annabelle was puzzled about why I brought a slide rule in. I remember my father saying when Texas Instruments and Hewlett Packards came out, I don't need one of those, I've always done it this way, right? Always done it this way. Why? When the TI instrument or the HP instrument was brilliant, could actually get calculations much more accurately and quickly than you could with a slide rule. Slide rule was brilliant for its day, but it's had its day. And yet here we are still doing the same old things with reforestation and restoration, and it's been pushed so often even by the authorities. This is a direct quote from the ecological tree planting and pasture conversion costs on the southern tablelands, written in 2020, same time that our paper came out on the cost-effective nature of planting. And it's dismissed our planting because it's a cost-effective forestry or carbon capture. So it was just dismissed out of hand. And none of our other papers, which had already been published at that stage, were cited in that report. Now, personally, I think that's ridiculous. Why would you ignore or dismiss evidence that actually shows you can actually do a better job? But it's also it's not very rigorous at all, as far as I'm concerned. Their estimates in that very report are for costs of 34 to 55,000 per hectare, when we showed already in that paper that we could get it down to about 7,000, according to the modelling. This is back in 2020. So why would they dismiss that just out of hand without taking it into account? And it's sort of an affront to many people in this room and our colleagues who have actually done the work to demonstrate there are better ways of doing it. And most of those papers are not cited in that report. So the problem, I think, is that we're stuck with the old slide rule days. We've always done it that way. We've always had close plantings and big plants and big pots and so on. We don't need to do it that way anymore. What we have to do is change the way we do things. Restoration occurs on other people's lands in most cases. You know, there's some tree changes, sure. We're probably guilty of being tree changers. But a lot of the people on the tablelands and the coast in the wet tropics are farmers. They own land. They've got parts of their property that they might consider replanting, but they're not going to do it because it appears to be too expensive. It's too slow. From our perspective, it's trying to recover the loss of the forest it's way too slow. And part of the problem is that scientific evidence doesn't necessarily win the argument. It's the social and community dialogue is much, much stronger in places where I live. If I go and talk to graziers when I'm at sales selling my cattle or buying new cattle, and we talk about this sort of thing, it's the argument that wins the day. It's not the evidence. I can't walk up to them with a scientific paper and say, here's the evidence, read the paper. They'd say, what are you talking about? You know, I've been on Facebook, I've seen the real world. However, the evidence, once you've persuaded people, is vital. So if you've got a scientific paper, which very few people other than scientists can read. Most papers get, I don't know, 10, 20 readers, maybe a few citations. But a lot of the papers are opaque to the general populace because they're written in scientific language with fancy graphs and so on, which is why I skipped over those other ones earlier. But once you've got the evidence and you can summarise it in ways that are meaningful to people, you can start to win the day and change attitudes. But at the same time, we're fighting this misinformation, disinformation about all of this sort of stuff. And it comes from all quarters, government departments, NGOs, community groups, and so on. Restoration has to be meaningful for land and valuable for landholders. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And therefore, it must be cost effective and must provide returns to compensate for the loss of income from the land that's being put under forest. Whether it's a gully or not, I mean, they say, okay, I can only graze one cow on those 2 hectares because there's almost no grass there. But I don't want to lose that one cow if I don't get paid for it, because the cow's maybe worth $1,500 or $2,000 when I sell it at the market. So why would I want to give up that income if I don't get some alternative income for it? So we've got to be aware that these things have to be pushed out into the community, discussed at cattle sales, at pubs, at clubs and that sort of thing, over the back fence. And these returns and the benefits to farmers have to be gained in a reasonable amount of time. So it's important that advice from the government and NGOs and community groups and nurseries and so on needs to recognise what makes it effective for landholders and farmers to take up this option of carbon farming. It's been said to me directly at a meeting where I was said, oh, here, go and talk to Noel because he knows about carbon farming. And he looked at me and said, no, I'm not going to do that. It's like planting a macadamia farm. I'm not going to get the returns from that anyway. So it's the same sort of cost, that same order of cost. So that's a reasonable response. Well, it's been presented as $50,000 a hectare. So why would anyone do carbon farming when you can get macadamias out of the same land? So there's misinformation can be pervasive, and yet the evidence is there, and the government authorities and NGOs and so on are not presenting that evidence in an effective and informative way. If you don't have that information and it's not attractive to farmers, then you're not going to persuade them. And once it becomes clear that you talk, a farmer say talks to a couple of organisations and they say, oh, you can plant a forest, but it's going to cost you 50, 60, 80,000. I've heard a hectare. You think, well, I'm not going to do it. And once it becomes implanted up here, it becomes gospel. And then they talk about it with their mates who are long-term farmers and graziers, and it becomes the truth. Therefore, that's the only way you can see it. And so we've got this constant problem of the slide rule, sticking to the old ways, and we're not accommodating the new ways in the information that's coming out from government and NGOs and community groups and so on. And that's a real disservice to what we're trying to do. And what I'm saying is that we need to, recognise that there are many different ways of doing things, and in some cases there's really good scientific information out there. There's a lot of questions still to answer, of course, but there's scientific evidence is out there, and it's up to the authorities, NGOs, and so on to collate that evidence and present it in a way that is palatable and meaningful on websites, in pamphlets. I don't care where it goes, but it's done in a way that says you've got a range of options to do. And one of the things that is a real problem is that it's often said, oh, we want a closed canopy forest. Most farmers and graziers will not want a closed canopy forest. They'll want a shelter belt or a tree lot, a timber lot. They might want to fell a few trees 25 years down the track because that's the time they've got sufficient size to grow them in the wet tropics, to fell them in the wet tropics. So you've got to give a few options, and you can come up with these options, and they're reasonable options. These figures are just purely speculative. It's based on the number of trees you might need to do for a shade belt or a timber lot. Open forest, not much more. Creek and gully protection, you might need a bit more because it's steeper country and it's more difficult to get into. Rainforest restoration, if you want to get a closed canopy, you might need to plant them at slightly closer spacings. But as I've demonstrated, each of those types of planting actually have biodiversity benefits. So it's not a one shoe fits all. It's a whole range of options that provide some biodiversity benefits to the wet tropics. It may just be a landing spot for spectacled flying foxes or pigeons or whatever else is coming in. But each of those is helping to restore the landscape to some degree, rather than leaving it in a very degraded state, which has very little biodiversity benefits. So in answer to the opening question is, can carbon farming help? Yeah, it can. It can get biodiversity and carbon benefits from it. And you get landholder benefits too, which is really important in persuading, in carrying an argument or persuading a landholder, many of whom are very conservative. I know personally I was for many years considered to be on the green line of the Upper Barron Road, because that's where the greenies were, and the other side was the real cattle producers. But I've got lovely fat cattle, so they can't really use that argument anymore. And it needs to be done in cost-effective professional ways, and you can do it. That's the crew of scientists and planters who planted our forest in 2011, and many of them came back in 2013 to plant some more trees. And in the bottom right-hand corner, there's one of the planters with a planter spade and bags of trees in little forestry tubes, planting them, and they're only about that tall and they're tiny, and they took off brilliantly. And we had 80 to 90% survival. So that's all I have for today.
Okay, questions? Okay, Susan.
Thank you, Noel. Sorry, I was a bit late. I do have a question. So what is it with the carbon farming market where they're not giving carbon benefits past 7 years? Like you get most of your credits within the first 7. Because for me, from looking at how rainforest grows, obviously the first 7, yes, you accrue some carbon, but it's really the next 7 where you're going to really make your hay in terms of how big the trees get and how much carbon they accrue. So why don't we get paid for the second 7 years?
We have a 25-year contract period, paid 25 years of growth. But we've got a bit of 100 years. Other methods allow 25-year carbon credit period and 25 years so reduce returns. So you do get 25 years. So we can get
Oh, because that's what I've heard from South Endeavour Trust, that they're getting paid for they're getting carbon credits for the first 7 years. I thought that was just a standard.
No, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
No, because you're standing away from the microphone.
I'm wearing.
Buried the mic.
So we've got a 25-year crediting period, which is the standard method. So I don't know where that 7 comes from.
I'm sorry, I should have asked you.
All right. Disembodied voice. Anybody else? Questions? Okay. Yep.
Noel, you spoke a little bit at the beginning about the land clearing, and I just wondered what's the main land use that people are clearing for, the motivation, and is there some? I mean, of course, it would be much better to not clear the mature forest and then have to replant it and grow a new forest. Are there opportunities to reduce the rate of land clearing?
It's a difficult question to answer. Clearing doesn't make sense. It's in, it might be for grazing, It might be for crops. I know some of it's done down the creek, running water. So why they would clear the banks of creeks, I have no idea. So some of it doesn't make sense. And I think part of the problem is that we as scientists and conservation people talk about these things all the time, and we regurgitate them and we discuss them. But a bulldozer doesn't discuss things; it just goes and bulldozes. So sometimes it's just clearing because they want to get rid of the trees. But sometimes it's for increasing their grazing area or putting in a crop or whatever. It's hard to from the SLATS data. It's really hard to tell what the purpose was. But it's clear that it is still happening, and at pace. It hasn't slowed down, despite the Vegetation Management Act and all the protections that are in place.
Noel, you're planting a timber resource. Is there a view in the future to log these?
Our place? No, we're not planning to log. Penny might be best to answer that on. I think there's a method whereby you can actually log the forest later.
There isn't at the moment, but one's being developed. So there is currently the government are looking at this so that you can actually plant your forest up and put a few timber trees in and then later on log them. And I think that will be a very appealing method for landholders. But at the moment, no. But we have signed up under, there's a variety of different methods, and ours is the environmental planting method, and that means that we cannot log. And we've got a 25-year crediting period, and our permanence is 100 years. So we have to look after it for 100 years.
And that 100 years is not trivial, which is one of the disincentives for landholders. They say, look, I'm not going to sign 100 years. That's 3 generations or 4 generations. I'm not going to sign my grandchildren's future away.
But you can sign for 25. But you can sign for 25, but you just get a little bit less money. But the thing is that we can get a fair bit of co-benefit money from biodiversity for our carbon. So that spot price of 34 at the moment, that might be half of what we can get, and that's for biodiversity. So it becomes quite valuable then. So if you take off off the top of my head, I think it's 20% discount if you have a 25-year permanence. And then, that's okay. It becomes a viable option.
Strategic spraying of salt. I've got another problem too. Fully the demonstration and also check for your income credits. Doesn't matter. Better than maybe not a scientific paper.
They've all got shiny new cars. Yeah, in answer to your second question, yes, I have said to graziers when they've challenged me about carbon farming as being non-viable, I've said, well, we've made more than $250,000 in the last decade or so from our trees, so that's not anything to be sneezed at on really steep poor country. It's we've shown it, and that does carry an argument or sway an argument. For the grass is probably the fiercest competitor. We've got 3 really, or maybe 4 really aggressive grasses. The big, not gamba grass, the Guinea grass that's ubiquitous in the region. We have 3 really aggressive species. That's the Soteria and the what used to be called Brachiaria is now Euroclara, and then the Melanus, which is a molasses grass. And each of those is fiercely competitive and will suppress growth. If you don't keep grass under control while the trees are getting above the grass, the plants usually die. But it doesn't take a dense planting to get rid of that grass. In our 3-metre spacings, which is 1,000 odd trees per hectare, if the trees survive, which is what we were talking about before, the increasing survival rate, then the grass disappears within about 3 years. So it's gone. And you can use grass selective sprays so that you, when you're going through spraying the rows of trees, you're only spraying the grass and it's only killing the grass. So you're not killing the trees with something like glyphosate. So there are ways of managing that quite well. So you don't need that dense planting to get that result. We've demonstrated many of our plots, not all, but many of our plots have shown that. And whether it's 3 metres or 1.75 metres apart, it doesn't seem to matter. As soon as you've got that canopy closure, you've won the day. In the plantings that are monocultures or maple, you've got a very different tree. It's a very different structure. And Susan and I were talking about this some time ago about the structure, where the first branches start. And if your first branches start, 3 metres up, then you're not getting canopy closure, or you're not getting shade to shade out the grasses. So in some ways, that's of benefit to a farmer who doesn't want to sacrifice their land completely. They might want a bit of a shade belt or a timber lot or whatever they want to call it, so that they can graze in between those trees and give the cattle a chance to get some shade. And that's really valuable to some farmers. So what I'm saying in that talk is, don't say it's one or nothing. Say there's a range of options. You can do it cheaply. Every farmer has a spray unit or a spray pack. Every farmer knows how to spray. Every farmer can look after land in their own way, and so that can eliminate your big cost, which is labour. If you plant at low densities, you might only have 1,000, 2,000 trees per 500 to 1,000 trees per hectare. So you might only have $2,000 to $3,000, $4,000 per hectare to plant it up, and then you've got to spray, maintain it. But sometimes you can actually do that at a very, very cheap cost, which is why I said those costs were indicative, and it depends very much on how you're doing it and what your circumstances are.
Alex writing about saying, well, really the best cost benefit are suppressing fire and suppressing trees. And those are places are different things. Thoughts on that notion specifically? I mean, I guess you're effectively spraying grass. You don't have any that's like fire. What are your thoughts on that? Well, I did it really most effective way to work larger.
The thing we found in our area, and this is common in the wet tropics, is that the grassed fields get blocked up. They become old fields. And the evidence is very clear that if you don't spray them out to some degree, nothing will grow in them. So those fierce competitive grasses really suppresses. So just taking cattle off, and we've got control plots in our experiment, obviously, which haven't moved in 13 years now. They haven't moved. It's still grass plot, and it's a straight line between a planted plot here, grass in between, just in that control. There's nothing moved except where that image I showed you, where we'd sprayed a control and trees germinated and were quick enough, mostly Alphatonia, the fast-growing sarsaparilla. They germinated and grew up quicker than the grass did. But without that intervention, it was going to sit there. And we've got several plots. Susan and Lawrence Porter have got several plots on our place looking at that very thing. What is the mechanism? Why does this grass suppress? Is it just the structure or the height or the moisture underneath? Or is it some other mechanism? Is it an allelopathic effect, or is there bacterial effect? Who knows? We don't know yet. So we're looking at that sort of stuff as well. So yeah, just taking cattle off or changing land use, it does seem, Susan was saying before that in the Ghana side, and is a Mexican side, that if you take cattle off there, stop using it, it just comes back as forest. But in our place, it doesn't, because we've got these exotic, fierce grasses.
Yeah, the grass is a we have a history and all the problem there. Grass was wasn't maintenance for a while. That's a you can see that. You just need the grass short.
Yeah.
Yeah. Doing a trial along there with the same species, the same 2.4 rows,
Yep.
and then down the middle, that driveway, little isolate.
Yep.
Start that now to see what's the cheapest maintenance. And
Yeah. And that's a perfect example of different ways of doing things. And that's very much a forestry practice where they plant rows of trees and then they just slash between. Yeah. 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 Well, I would have been at the bottom of the hill if I took a slasher on our slopes, but it's just that the nature of the country. But you know, there are many ways of doing these things, and if you recognise what the impediments to the resolving this problem of loss of forest, then maybe we can turn it around. But we need to all be aware of the impediments and how we can actually resolve them through pressure from, I don't know, whatever organisations you're with. It's a bit hard to know. We've got, we did some remodelling of wood density. Wood density is really important in how much carbon a tree holds, because the higher density, naturally there's more carbon in it. And our trees vary between about 400 and 800, 900 grams per cubic metre, whatever it is. So it's quite a variable. And so if you go from 400 to 800, you've got double the carbon. But the high density trees grow more slowly, so it's hard to say. So the quandong, the Elaeocarpus, grows really fast, or the lightwood bleeding heart, it'll grow fast and have a big bulb, but it won't have much carbon because it's a low density wood. Whereas the Flinders,ia, the Queensland maple, has a wood density of around 600 or something like that. You might be able to correct me on that, but so it grows fairly fast, but it's got a higher wood density, so it carries more carbon. So it depends on your mix of species. But I think the evidence that we've found is that if you have a mixed species, you're going to have likely more success, because you're getting different structural elements and you've got different functional elements as well. So figs, for instance, on the edge of plantings might bring in the birds that drop the seeds that regenerate underneath. And the structural mix also gives you the shading, whereas the monocultures that we used, some were very poor performers in some situations, and Lucas and Alex and Penny and I did some work on that to examine why they didn't grow very well at all in the upper slopes, whereas within a few metres down they were growing, they're 10 metres tall now. So we didn't understand that. We wrote a paper on it because we needed to understand that. So we examined the soils and stuff. Yeah.